The air in the market was thick with heat and misery, clinging to skin like an oil slick. The scent of rusted metal, unwashed bodies, and something foul, something rotting, made it hard to breathe. Voices rose in a chaotic symphony of bartering, arguing, and the occasional scream of someone whose fate had just been sealed with a bid. Arthur should have kept walking. This wasn't his business. And yet, his feet stayed planted at the edge of the crowd, his gaze fixed on the makeshift auction block. Atop it stood a woman, not shackled, not restrained, but just as much a prisoner as any of the others being sold. Her dark eyes swept the crowd, but they weren't searching for kindness. Kindness did not exist in a place like this. "I offer myself as property," she declared, her voice steady despite the quiet tremor in her limbs. "In exchange, my son must be fed and protected." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some scoffed, others averted their eyes. She was the wrong kind, too wild, too stubborn, too dangerous to break. Even starving, even desperate, she held herself with a defiant grace that repelled the worst of them. Slavers did not want those who would fight back. The boy at her side, small and thin, clung to the tattered fabric of her cloak. He had his mother's skin, a rich shade of violet, dulled by malnutrition, and eyes too large for his gaunt face. His tiny fingers curled into the material, his grip white-knuckled, though whether it was from fear or determination, Arthur couldn't tell. The auctioneer sighed, tapping his rusted metal cane against the wooden platform. "No offers." He sounded bored. "Then we move on to 2,000 credits," Arthur said. The words left his mouth before he had fully decided to speak them. A hush fell over the square. The woman stiffened, her breath catching. Slowly, her gaze snapped to him, searching wary. The auctioneer, eager to move things along, barely hesitated before slamming his cane against the podium. Sold. The transaction was over. Simple, cold, and yet nothing about this moment felt simple. Arthur stepped forward, ignoring the eyes tracking his every movement. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't the kind of man who saved people. But as he looked at her, thin but still standing, barely holding herself together but refusing to break, he knew he had done the only thing he could live with. The woman didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she turned and knelt before the boy, resting a hand on his small shoulders. "Oren," she whispered, his wide, luminous eyes locked onto hers. He was too young to fully understand what had just happened, but he knew enough. He clutched at her cloak, shaking his head. "I don't want to go." His voice wavered, but he held firm. Her fingers curled around the back of his head, gently pressing his forehead to hers. "We stay together." The words were a promise. Then, finally, she stood, lifting her chin as she turned to Arthur. "You made a mistake, human," she murmured. Arthur met her gaze, unflinching. "Maybe." She exhaled sharply, but whatever she wanted to say, she swallowed it down. She reached for Oren's hand, gripping it tightly, as if she could keep him safe through sheer force of will. A voice, small but firm, cut through the space between them. "Bayım." Arthur looked down. The boy was staring at him, unblinking. "Annemi satın aldınız mı?" His voice was quiet, but edged with something sharp. "O gerçekten güçlüdür. Dövüşebilir. Ve çok fazla olmasa bile en iyi yemeği yapar." Arthur's jaw clenched. Oren had no idea what it meant to be bought. He was too young to grasp the weight of those words. And yet there was something in his voice, something old, something tired, that didn't belong in a child. Arthur crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "I didn't buy her to hurt her." Oren didn't look convinced. His small shoulders squared, his tiny hands balled into fists. "Sadece annemi değil, beni de satın aldınız mı?" Arthur hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't thought about that. He had seen the woman, seen the way she stood, and acted before he could think. But now, staring into the boy's unblinking gaze, he realized there had never been another option. "You're both coming with me," he said finally, "and you won't be harmed. That's all you need to know right now." Oren's expression didn't change. Beside him, his mother let out a slow breath. "And if I don't believe you?" Arthur straightened. "Then you'll just have to watch and see." For a long moment, she studied him, weighing something in her mind. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned. "Come, Orin." The boy hesitated, then followed, but not before giving Arthur one last, long stare. As they walked, Arthur could feel the woman's tension, could sense the way she kept her body angled slightly between him and her son, as if expecting him to strike at any moment. He didn't blame her. When they reached the docking bay, the woman stopped abruptly, gripping Orin's shoulder. Arthur turned just in time to see the sheer panic flicker across her face before she buried it beneath a hardened mask. "If you take him from me," her voice was quiet, but there was something raw in it, something desperate. "If you so much as try, I'm not a monster." Arthur's voice was firm but calm. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto his. "Everyone says that," she whispered. Arthur exhaled through his nose. He had no defense against that. No words that could undo the damage done to her. The fear seared into her bones. So instead, he turned and walked up the ramp into his ship. Behind him, after a long pause, he heard small footsteps hesitantly follow. And then finally hers. The moment the ramp sealed shut behind them, the weight of the outside world faded into silence. The market's filth, the stench of desperation, and the judging stares of strangers were left behind, swallowed by the artificial hum of the ship's systems. For Arthur, it was just another day, just another takeoff. For Rel and Orin, it was something else entirely. The boy stood frozen, his small violet fingers gripping the edge of his mother's tattered cloak. His wide, luminescent eyes darted around the metal walls, the overhead panels, the dim corridor stretching ahead. The artificial lighting cast a soft glow over his deep purple skin, illuminating his features with something close to wonder. "This is a ship?" Orin whispered, barely daring to breathe. Arthur glanced down at him, amused despite himself. "You've never been on one?" The boy shook his head, eyes still locked on the curved ceiling, the subtle vibrations beneath his feet as the ship powered up. "I thought they'd be bigger." Arthur smirked. "Some are. This one's just cozy." Orin hesitated, then turned to his mother. "Mama, did you ever go on one before?" Rel's expression barely shifted, but Arthur caught the way her fingers twitched at her side. A memory flickered behind her guarded eyes. Something buried, something painful. She reached for Orin's hand. "Once," she said simply. Arthur didn't pry. Instead, he gestured down the hallway. "Come on. You might as well see where you'll be sleeping." Orin hesitated only a second before hurrying after him, his mother close behind. The boy's initial wariness had not disappeared, but curiosity had begun to creep in, pushing his fear aside. His small feet patted lightly against the floor as he peered through open doorways, eyes flicking across control panels and flickering lights like he was drinking in every detail. "Where do you drive it?" he asked, craning his neck to look at Arthur. Arthur chuckled. "Pilot it, kid." And up front, he jerked a thumb toward the cockpit. "I'll show you later, if your mom doesn't object." Orin turned to Rel expectantly, but her expression remained unreadable. She gave Arthur a look that said, "I will kill you if you so much as think about putting my son in danger," but she didn't refuse outright. Arthur took that as a win. He led them further inside, stopping at a small door on the right. He pressed a panel, and the door slid open with a quiet hiss. "Not much," he admitted, stepping aside, "but it's yours." The room was small, just a cot against the wall, a storage unit, and a compact washing station. Functional, clean, but undeniably plain. Rel stepped inside first, eyes scanning every inch. She checked the corners, the doorframe, even the air vent. Not carelessly, not out of idle curiosity, but with the trained caution of someone who had learned, painfully, that safety was a lie. Orin, however, had no such instincts. He hopped onto the cot immediately, testing its softness with an eager bounce. "It's soft," he declared, looking up at his mother like he had just discovered a miracle. Rel exhaled, a fraction of her tension easing. "It's better than the ground." Arthur crossed his arms. "High praise." She ignored him. Orin flopped onto his back, staring at the ceiling. His tiny fingers traced an invisible pattern against the metal. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Arthur leaned against the doorframe. Not forever. Just until we figure things out. Oren turned his head. What's to figure out? Arthur hesitated. The kid's voice was light, but there was something beneath it. Something small and fragile and desperately searching for reassurance. Rel answered before Arthur could. That's not your concern, she said gently, sitting beside him. Oren frowned, but didn't argue. Arthur took that as his cue to leave. Get settled. I'll be in the galley. He turned to go, but a quiet voice stopped him. Is there food? Arthur looked back. Oren was sitting up again, his hands curled in his lap, his expression carefully neutral. He tried to sound casual, but Arthur had heard that tone before. The false lightness, the forced indifference, the way a starving child asked for something they weren't sure they were allowed to have. Arthur's jaw tightened. Yeah, kid, there's food. Oren blinked, as if he hadn't expected that answer. He turned to his mother for confirmation, but Rel's expression was unreadable. Arthur jerked his head toward the corridor. Come on. Oren hesitated, then slid off the cot, padding silently after him. Rel followed, her presence a silent, ever-watchful shadow. The galley was small, practical. A metal table sat in the center. A storage unit lined one wall, and the faint hum of the cooling system filled the air. Arthur moved to the cabinet, pulling out a few ration packs. They weren't fancy, but they were real food, protein bars, nutrient-dense bread, a few vacuum-sealed fruit slices. He set them on the table and stepped back. Rel didn't move. Arthur arched a brow. What now? She was staring at the food, unmoving. Then, slowly, she picked up one of the ration bars and turned it over in her hands. You eat first. Arthur blinked. Then he understood. She thought it might be poisoned. His stomach twisted, but he didn't argue. Instead, he unwrapped one of the bars, took a slow bite, and swallowed. When he was done, he set the empty wrapper on the table and gestured. See? Not dead. Rel's grip tightened around the ration pack, but after a moment, she unwrapped it and took a bite. Arthur leaned against the counter, watching. You gonna let the kid eat? Or does he have to pass a test too? Rel shot him a glare, but broke off a piece of her bar and placed it in front of Oren. The boy hesitated. Then, carefully, he picked it up and nibbled at the edge. Arthur looked away, giving them the illusion of privacy. He busied himself with the cooling unit, pulling out a small canister of water. He poured some into a metal cup and slid it toward Oren. The boy stared at it, then up at him. Arthur sighed. It's just water, kid. Oren hesitated, then reached out and took a sip. When nothing happened, he drank more, faster, like he expected it to be taken away at any moment. Arthur said nothing. He had seen this before. Rel had, too. She pressed her palm to Oren's back in slow, soothing circles, her fingers lingering just a little longer than necessary. Arthur exhaled. Why do you sell yourself? Rel didn't look up. You know why? Yeah, he admitted. I do. She said nothing. Oren finished his food, setting the wrapper aside with careful precision. He swung his legs under the table, eyes flicking between them. Arthur raised a brow. Oren hesitated. Are we gonna stay here a long time? Arthur met his gaze, considering his answer. You'll stay as long as you need to. Oren frowned, as if trying to decide if that was good enough. After a moment, he nodded. Arthur pushed away from the counter. Get some rest. Oren slid off the chair, padding silently toward the corridor. Rel followed, pausing only for a second as she passed Arthur. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't need to. Arthur watched them disappear down the hall, then leaned against the counter, rubbing a hand over his face. What the hell had he gotten himself into? Arthur had been in space long enough to recognize when a ship felt different. It wasn't something you could see or hear. It was in the air, in the way sound carried, in the way silence stretched. His ship had always been quiet, but this was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't solitude. It wasn't peace. It was waiting. He could feel it in the tension woven through the corridors, in the way Rel lingered near doorways, never quite stepping in, never quite letting her guard drop. He could see it in Oren's hesitant movements, the way the boy drifted toward the unfamiliar while constantly glancing over his shoulder, waiting for permission that never came. Arthur hadn't been expecting company, much less a half-starved woman and a kid who had never seen space before. But now, as he sat in the dim light of the cockpit, feet propped up on the control panel, he knew that whatever had started at that auction block wasn't over yet. It was only beginning. The ship hummed around him, steady and predictable, a comfort after years of piloting. The autopilot was engaged, their course set, though where exactly he hadn't decided yet. He told himself he'd figure that out later. A soft shuffle caught his ear. Arthur didn't move, just tilted his head slightly to confirm what he already knew. Oren stood in the doorway of the cockpit, his small frame bathed in the cool blue glow of the instrument panels. The boy's eyes weren't on him. They were locked onto the vast stretch of stars outside the viewport. Arthur let the silence sit. Oren was waiting for something, permission, maybe, or just the comfort of not being sent away. "You gonna stand there all night?" Arthur asked, his voice even. Oren startled slightly, but didn't back away. He hesitated, then took a small step forward. "Can I sit?" Arthur gestured toward the co-pilot's chair. "Go ahead." The boy climbed up, his small hands gripping the edges of the seat as he settled in. The chair was too big for him, his legs dangling over the side, but he didn't seem to care. His fingers hovered near the control panel, not touching, just watching. "This drives the ship?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Pilots it," Arthur corrected. Oren glanced at him. "What's the difference?" Arthur smirked. "Driving's for ground vehicles. Piloting's for space." Oren absorbed the information, nodding slightly. He turned back to the viewport, his expression one of quiet wonder. "I didn't think space would be this big," he admitted. Arthur huffed a small chuckle. "It's bigger than you can imagine, kid." Oren let out a long breath, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest. "Mama always said space was dangerous," he said. Arthur tilted his head. "She's not wrong. But it's beautiful," Oren murmured. Arthur watched him carefully. There was something about the way the boy spoke, the way he stared at the stars like he was memorizing them, as if he had never believed he would get the chance to see them for himself. "You ever been off-world before?" Arthur asked. Oren shook his head. "We always had to hide." Arthur's muscles tensed slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. "Hiding from what?" he asked carefully. Oren hesitated. His fingers curled into his lap, his shoulders drawing in slightly. "Mama said bad people were looking for us." Arthur exhaled slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Did they ever find you?" Oren shook his head. "Mama made sure they didn't." Arthur's jaw tightened. So it was as he had suspected. Rel and Oren weren't just desperate. They weren't just survivors. They were prey. The question was, who was hunting them? Arthur glanced toward the hallway, where he knew Rel was probably awake, listening. He could push for answers, press Oren for more details. But the kid already looked wary, already seemed like he had said more than he was supposed to. So Arthur just nodded. "Well, they're not going to find you here." Oren looked up at him, eyes searching. Arthur held his gaze. He meant what he said. The kid must have believed him, because after a moment, he nodded. "Where are we going?" Oren asked. Arthur hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? He hadn't planned past getting them off that godforsaken planet. He had no destination, no next step, but he couldn't tell the kid that. "Somewhere safe," he said finally. Oren frowned slightly, as if trying to decide if that answer was good enough. After a moment, he nodded. His gaze drifted back to the stars, a small smile ghosting across his lips. Arthur let the silence stretch between them. Then, a sound from the hallway. Arthur looked up just in time to see Rel standing in the doorway. She wasn't glaring at him, wasn't crossing her arms in that usual defensive stance. But she was watching. She had been listening. "Oren," she said softly. "It's late." Oren sighed, but didn't argue. He slid off the chair, casting one last, lingering glance at the viewport before trudging toward his mother. As he passed her, she reached out, brushing a hand over his hair, fingers threading briefly through the dark strands. Arthur expected her to leave without a word, but she didn't. She lingered. "You shouldn't fill his head with dreams," she said finally. Arthur raised a brow. "He's a kid. He should get to have some." Rel's expression didn't change. "Dreams get you killed." Arthur studied her. "Or they keep you going." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, guiding Oren down the corridor. Arthur exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had a feeling she wasn't entirely wrong. But looking at that kid, staring out at the stars like they were calling to him, Arthur couldn't bring himself to believe it. Arthur had spent years aboard this ship, enough time to know every groan of the hull, every hum of the engines, every subtle flicker of the lights. He had learned its quirks the way some men learn to read faces. Knowing when a vibration meant a stabilizer was acting up, when a delay in power transfer signaled an aging component. It was his. It had always been his. But now it didn't feel the same. It wasn't anything obvious. The walls were the same dull steel, the corridors just as narrow, the smell of old wiring and engine grease still thick in the air. But there was a presence now, a weight in the quiet. It was in the way Rel moved through the ship, always watchful, always careful, never quite settling in. It was in the way Oren whispered to himself as he explored, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile sense of belonging he was trying to find. Arthur had taken them in on instinct, but instinct hadn't accounted for what came after. What the hell was he supposed to do with them now? He was in the cargo bay, half buried in an open panel, running diagnostics on a failing power relay, when he heard the footsteps. Not Oren's, too heavy. Not hesitant, either. He didn't look up. "You need something, or are you just here to remind me how terrible my ship is?" Rel's voice was flat. "I want to talk." Arthur wiped his hands on a rag before sitting up. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her face unreadable as always. She looked more put together than when he had first seen her, clean, rested, her dark hair neatly braided back, but the sharpness in her gaze hadn't dulled. "All right," Arthur said, tossing the rag onto a crate. "Talk." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What do you want?" Arthur frowned. "What do you mean? You took us in. You gave us food, a place to sleep. No one does something for nothing." Arthur leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. "You think I'm waiting to collect a debt?" Rel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Aren't you?" Arthur exhaled. "I don't know how to make this any clearer. I did it because I could." She studied him, searching for the angle she was convinced had to be there. Finally, she exhaled sharply. "That's not how the world works." Arthur smirked. "Maybe not your world." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. He studied her, noting the way her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, the way her stance remained ready, as if she expected something to go wrong at any moment. She was waiting for the trap, waiting for the moment this kindness turned into something she had to fight against. "You don't trust me," Arthur said. She held his gaze. "You haven't given me a reason to." Arthur tilted his head. "And I haven't given you a reason not to." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She hated that answer. She sighed, shifting her weight against a crate, mirroring his stance, but keeping a careful distance between them. "You don't ask questions. Not about where we came from. Not about who we're running from." Arthur shrugged. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Rel let out a humorless laugh. "And what if I never am?" Arthur met her gaze. "Then I guess I'll have to be patient." Something flickered in her expression, something beyond suspicion, something quieter. "You're different," she said finally. Arthur smirked. "I get that a lot." Rel exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't know what to do with you." Arthur chuckled. "Well, that makes two of us." The silence stretched between them, but this time it didn't feel quite so heavy. Then from the corridor, a small voice. "Mama." Oren's head peeked around the corner, his eyes flickering between them. Rel straightened immediately, her posture shifting back into that protective stance, but there was no tension in her face. Arthur pushed off the workbench. "What's up, kid?" Oren hesitated. I had a question." Arthur smirked. "You always have questions." Oren frowned slightly, then glanced at his mother. Rel's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. Oren looked back at Arthur. "You said we're going somewhere safe." Arthur nodded. "That's right." Oren hesitated, then tilted his head. "Do you have a safe place?" Arthur stilled. It was an innocent question, but cut deeper than he expected. He had spent years moving from one place to another, never staying anywhere too long, never letting himself get too attached. He had stations where he could refuel, ports where he had contacts, but a safe place? That was something else entirely. He hadn't had one of those in a long time, and Orin, young as he was, seemed to see that. Arthur forced a smirk. Safe is a relative term, kid. Orin frowned. That's not an answer. Arthur huffed a quiet laugh. No, I guess it's not. Orin chewed his lip, considering something. Then, cautiously, he asked, Can we stay? Arthur blinked. Rel stiffened beside him. Orin. But Orin turned to her. Mama, we don't have anywhere else. His voice was small, but there was a steady resolve behind it. I like it here. Arthur rubbed the back of his neck, unsure of what to say. He hadn't planned for any of this. Hadn't planned for them to be here longer than a few days. Hadn't planned for a kid to look up at him and ask if this ship could be a home. He glanced at Rel. She was staring at her son, her expression torn between guilt, hesitation, and something else, something unfamiliar. Hope. Arthur exhaled, looking between them. Let's just take things one step at a time, he said finally. We'll figure it out as we go. Orin studied him for a moment, then nodded. Rel didn't say anything, but she didn't argue either. Arthur watched as she took Orin's hand and led him back down the corridor. She hesitated before turning the corner, glancing back at him. It was the first time she looked at him without suspicion. Then she was gone. Arthur let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. This was getting complicated, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind. Then, a sharp beep cut through the silence. Arthur frowned, his fingers hovering over the console as he studied the screen. Unknown sender. No identification. That was never a good sign. He exhaled through his nose, debating whether to ignore it. He could easily pretend he hadn't seen it, let the message get lost in the void of space. But something about it made his gut tighten. He tapped the controls, bringing up a scrambled waveform of the incoming signal. Whoever had sent it knew what they were doing. It wasn't an open broadcast, not something a trader or station official would send. It was direct, purposeful, targeted. Arthur's jaw clenched. Problem. He turned his head slightly. Rel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her dark eyes locked onto the flashing light, as if she already knew it wasn't going to be good news. Unknown transmission, Arthur said. No ID, encrypted. Someone went through the trouble of finding this ship, but they don't want me to know who they are. Rel's fingers curled slightly at her sides. Can you trace it? Arthur shook his head. Not easily. Whoever sent it masked their location. I can bounce the signal through the ship's relay and strip a few layers of encryption, but it'll take time. She stepped further inside, the tension rolling off her in waves. Play it. Arthur hesitated, then tapped a command. The speakers crackled. At first, there was only static. Then a distorted voice came through, mechanical and distant. Captain Vance. Arthur's back stiffened. It wasn't his name that put him on edge. It was the way it was said. Calm. Certain. Like the sender already knew exactly who he was. We know what you have, the voice continued. You're harboring stolen property. Arthur's fingers twitched over the controls. Rel inhaled sharply beside him, but she didn't speak. You will surrender it, the voice went on, or we will take it. Static swallowed the final words, and then the message was gone. The cockpit fell into silence, thick and heavy. Arthur exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair. Well, that's vague and ominous. Rel didn't move. She was staring at the console, her jaw tight, her breathing just a little too controlled. Arthur glanced at her. I take it you recognize that voice? She swallowed. No. He arched a brow. She clenched her fists. I don't need to. I know what they are. Arthur exhaled through his nose. You gonna tell me? Or do I get to keep playing guesswork while some mystery bastards track us through the void? Rel didn't answer right away. She turned, pacing a short line across the cockpit before stopping abruptly. They're not after you, she said finally. They're after me. And Orin. Arthur waited, letting the silence stretch, giving her the space to decide how much she was willing to say. Her shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. There's a group, she said. They don't go by a name, not publicly, but you'd know them if you saw them. They deal in trade, sentience mostly. The ones people think don't matter. The ones without power, without protection. They find them, take them, and then they sell them to whoever's willing to pay. Arthur's jaw clenched. Slavers. His hands curled into fists before he forced himself to relax them. They had me, Rel admitted, her voice quieter now. Years ago, I got out. I ran, and they didn't like that. Arthur exhaled slowly, his mind fitting the pieces together. And Oren, Rel's grip tightened at her sides. They wanted him, not for labor, not for trade, for experiments. Arthur's gut twisted. Rel turned to face him, her expression unreadable. I don't know how they found us again. We stayed off the grid for years. I've been careful. She exhaled sharply. But they always come back. Arthur studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned back to the console, fingers flying over the controls as he pulled up the ship's navigation screen. Rel frowned. What are you doing? Changing course, Arthur said. They sent that message because they think they know where we are, which means sitting still is the dumbest thing we could do. The engines hummed beneath them as Arthur input a new route, setting their course toward one of the more isolated sectors of the system. Rel crossed her arms. You don't have to do this. Arthur snorted. You're right. I don't. He tapped a command, locking in the coordinates. And yet, here we are. She stared at him, searching his face. This isn't your fight. Arthur met her gaze. It is now. Something flickered in her expression. Something sharp, uncertain, unreadable. Then, from the corridor, a small voice. Mama! They both turned. Oren stood just outside the cockpit, rubbing his eyes, his small frame backlit by the dim hallway lights. His voice was groggy, but there was a tension in his stance, as if even in sleep he had sensed something was wrong. Rel was at his side in an instant, crouching to his level, her hands on his shoulders. It's all right, she murmured. Go back to bed. Oren blinked up at Arthur instead. What happened? Arthur hesitated. He could lie. He could brush it off, tell the kid everything was fine. But Oren had lived his whole life on the run. He had learned to recognize danger the way other kids learned bedtime stories. Arthur sighed. We might have some trouble coming our way. Oren's eyes flickered with understanding far beyond his years. But he didn't look afraid. He looked at Rel, his mother, his protector, the one who had always kept him safe. And then, slowly, cautiously, he looked at Arthur, like he was deciding if Arthur was part of that safety now, too. Arthur exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Go get some rest, kid. I've got this. Oren studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Rel watched as he turned and padded back down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. She straightened, her gaze lingering on the hallway. Arthur leaned back against the console, crossing his arms. We should probably talk about what happens when they find us. Rel's jaw tightened. If. Arthur smirked. I like the optimism, but let's be real when... She exhaled, turning to face him fully. I won't let them take him. Arthur nodded. Good. Rel frowned slightly. You believe me? Arthur met her gaze. I believe you die before letting that happen. His voice was steady, but I'd rather not let it come to that. She studied him, something unreadable in her expression. Then, finally, she gave a slow nod. Arthur exhaled, glancing back at the blinking red light on the console. Things had just gotten a hell of a lot more complicated. And for the first time in years, he cared. Arthur had been in plenty of fights before. Brawls in back-alley cantinas, shootouts on lawless moons, narrow escapes from planetary enforcers who didn't take kindly to smugglers. He had run, he had fought, and he had survived. But this was different. This time, he wasn't fighting to save himself. This time, there were people on his ship, people who mattered. The emergency decompression had worked. The slavers had been ripped from the airlock, their ship forced to disengage before it was dragged along with them into the vacuum of space. Alarms still flashed in warning, but the danger, for now, had passed. Arthur pushed himself up from the floor, shaking off the disorientation of the sudden shift in gravity. Across from him, Rel did the same, her breathing quick but controlled. She was already scanning the corridor for threats, her grip tight on the pistol he had handed her. He exhaled and leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow. Well, he muttered, that was exciting. Rel shot him a glare. Exciting? We were nearly killed. Arthur grinned. Yeah, but nearly killed isn't actually killed. That's an important distinction. She looked like she wanted to hit him. Instead, she turned toward the corridor. Oren, small footsteps echoed through the ship as the boy came running. He skidded to a stop just inside the doorway, wide-eyed, scanning both of them as if checking for injuries. "You're okay," he asked, his voice small. Rel crouched and pulled him into a tight embrace. "We're fine," she murmured, running a hand over his dark hair. "We're fine." Arthur watched them, something tight settling in his chest. Oren pulled back slightly. "What happened?" Arthur hesitated. He could have softened the truth, but the kid had already been through too much to be coddled. "Bad guys tried to take you," he said simply. "We didn't let them." Oren's expression darkened. He wasn't scared. He wasn't crying. He was angry. Arthur raised a brow. "Something on your mind, kid?" Oren hesitated, glancing at his mother before looking back at Arthur. "I saw him," Oren whispered. "The man in the suit. The one you—" He gestured toward the airlock. Arthur felt a slow chill creep up his spine. "The leader?" he asked carefully. Oren nodded. "I've seen him before." Rel stiffened beside him. "Where?" Oren swallowed hard. "In the lab." Arthur's blood ran cold. Rel went pale. Arthur crouched down to Oren's level, keeping his voice steady. "You remember him?" Oren nodded again. "He was there when they took me. He didn't talk much, but he was always watching, like he was waiting for something." His fingers curled into fists. "I think he's the one who gave the orders." Arthur exchanged a glance with Rel. She inhaled shakily. "He's not just a slaver," she murmured. "He's something worse." Arthur had spent years dealing with criminals, syndicates, and mercenaries. But slavers were different. They weren't just running a business. They enjoyed what they did. And the ones who experimented on their captives? They were the worst of them all. Arthur straightened, his jaw tightening. "If he was watching you before, he'll be watching again." Rel nodded grimly. "We need to leave." Arthur was already ahead of her, moving back to the cockpit and slamming into his chair. His fingers danced over the controls, checking the status of their pursuers. The slaver ship had drifted, its systems struggling to recover from the forced separation. It wasn't gone, just damaged. Not good enough. Arthur adjusted the thrusters, setting in new coordinates. "We're jumping. Now." Rel slid into the co-pilot's seat, scanning the radar. "Are they still tracking us?" "Probably," Arthur muttered. "But let's make it harder for them." The ship vibrated as the engines roared to life. Arthur engaged the hyperburn, pushing the old vessel faster than was strictly safe. The stars outside the viewport stretched, blurred, and then they were gone. Silence filled the cockpit. The only sound was the faint hum of the ship stabilizing after the sudden jump. Arthur exhaled and leaned back in his chair. That should buy us some time. Rel was watching him, not with suspicion this time, not even with skepticism. Something had shifted. "You saved us," she said quietly. Arthur rolled his shoulders. "Yeah, well, can't have my ship getting taken over by slavers. Bad for business." Rel gave him a look. "That's not why you did it." Arthur met her gaze, the smirk fading slightly. "No," he admitted. "It's not." A long silence stretched between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy. Then, Rel let out a breath and leaned back at her seat. "So what now?" Arthur tilted his head, considering the question. "We keep moving. We stay ahead of them. And we find a way to stop them from coming after you again." Rel studied him. "You're really in this, aren't you?" Arthur smirked. "What can I say? You two are growing on me." Rel huffed a quiet laugh. Arthur turned his head toward the doorway, where Oren stood, still watching them. "You all right, kid?" he asked. Oren hesitated. Then, carefully, he took a step closer. "Are you going to teach me how to fly?" Arthur blinked. "What?" Oren glanced at the controls. "You're a pilot, and if we're staying on the ship, I should learn." Arthur exchanged a look with Rel, who gave a small shrug. Arthur exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Kid, I barely trust you not to touch the wrong button. Teaching you to fly is another thing entirely." Oren's face fell slightly, but before Arthur could say anything else, he added, "But I guess we could start with the basics." Oren's eyes lit up. "Really?" Arthur groaned. "I'm going to regret this, aren't I?" Rel smirked. "Absolutely." Arthur sighed and motioned for Oren to come forward. The boy hurried into the cockpit, climbing into the co-pilot's seat. Arthur rested his hands on the controls and glanced at Rel. He said, voice lighter now, you two are really messing up my whole lone wolf thing. Rel arched a brow. I think you stopped being a lone wolf the second you decided to save us. Arthur chuckled. Yeah, I think you're right. The ship drifted through the endless stretch of space, moving toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in a long time, Arthur wasn't running alone. And that felt right. The ship drifted through deep space, a lone speck in the vast, silent void. Arthur sat in the cockpit, boots propped up on the console, eyes scanning the navigation screen. The jump had bought them time, but not enough. The slavers were still out there, licking their wounds, regrouping. It was only a matter of time before they picked up the trail again. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Something wrong. Rel's voice came from the doorway. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching him with her usual quiet intensity. Arthur smirked. You mean besides the fact that we're being hunted by a crew of psychotic traffickers with a personal grudge? Rel raised a brow. That part one assumed. Arthur sat up, lowering his feet to the floor. We need a plan, he admitted. Running can only buy us so much time. Rel stepped into the cockpit, her gaze shifting to the control panel. Do you have somewhere in mind? Arthur hesitated. He had been weighing their options ever since the fight. They needed a place to hide, at least for a while. But not just anywhere, somewhere safe, which meant he had only one real choice. I know a guy, Arthur said. Runs a station just outside the Kesrin Belt. It's off the charts, not exactly legal, but it's quiet. We could lay low, resupply, figure out our next move. Rel studied him. And you trust him? Arthur let out a short laugh. Trust? No, but he owes me, which is the next best thing. Rel nodded slowly. How long until we get there? Arthur tapped a few commands into the NAV system. 12 hours, give or take. Rel exhaled, leaning against the co-pilot's seat. For the first time since they had boarded his ship, she looked tired. Arthur studied her for a moment. You should get some rest, he said. She gave him a dry look. That's funny. I was about to say the same to you. Arthur smirked. I don't sleep much. Neither do I, she admitted. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy. Finally, Rel spoke. You should have left us on that station. Arthur arched a brow. That's gratitude for you. She sighed, shaking her head. I mean it. You didn't sign up for this. And now, because of me, you have slavers on your tail. That's not something you just walk away from. Arthur's smirk faded. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Rel, he said, voice quieter now. I didn't save you because I wanted something in return. And I'm not sticking around because I feel trapped in this. I chose this. Rel held his gaze. Arthur shrugged. Besides, I've pissed off worse people. That got a small, reluctant smirk out of her. You really do have a problem with self-preservation, she muttered. Arthur grinned. Comes with the job. She shook her head, then glanced toward the corridor. I should check on Oren. Arthur nodded. Yeah, make sure he's not reprogramming my engines. Rel snorted and turned to leave. Arthur watched her go, exhaling slowly. This was getting complicated, and for once, he didn't mind. Oren sat cross-legged on the floor of the cargo bay, surrounded by scattered tools and spare parts. He was staring intently at a small mechanical panel, his fingers carefully adjusting the wiring inside. Rel crouched beside him. What are you doing? Oren didn't look up. Fixing this. Rel arched a brow. Fixing what exactly? He finally glanced at her, a little sheepish. The sensor array. It's old. And slow. Rel blinked. And you know how to fix that? Oren grinned. Arthur showed me some things. His sight. She should have guessed. The two of them had been spending more time together lately. Arthur grumbling every time Oren bombarded him with questions, Oren following him around the ship like an eager shadow. It was strange. She had spent so long keeping Oren at a distance from people, never letting anyone get close enough to matter. It had been the only way to keep him safe. And yet, here he was comfortable. Here she was allowing it. She wasn't sure what to make of that. Oren went back to his project, his small fingers twisting wires together with practiced precision. Do you think Arthur likes having us here? Rel blinked at the unexpected question. Why do you ask? Oren shrugged. Because he says we're staying. And I like it here. But I don't know if he wants us here, or if he just feels like he has to keep us safe. Rel hesitated. She could tell him that Arthur was just another drifter, that he wasn't someone they could rely on. But that wasn't true anymore, was it? She exhaled. I think Arthur doesn't do things unless he wants to. Oren considered that. Then quietly he said, I hope we stay. Rel swallowed the lump in her throat. She reached out, running a hand over his hair. Me too, little one. Arthur was adjusting the ship's course when the alarm flared to life. A proximity warning. His stomach tightened. That was too soon. Rel appeared in the doorway almost immediately, eyes sharp. What is it? Arthur's fingers flew over the console, scanning the incoming signature. A ship, not the slavers, too small, but fast, and locked onto their trajectory. Arthur's jaw clenched. We got company. Rel was already reaching for her weapon. Can we outrun them? Arthur checked the thruster levels. Maybe, but they're gaining fast. Rel nodded, already shifting into action. I'll wake Oren. Arthur grabbed her wrist before she could turn away. She tensed, eyes flashing in surprise. Wait, Arthur said. Let's not panic just yet. She held his gaze, then nodded slowly. Arthur released her and turned back to the controls. He switched the comms on, adjusting the frequency. A crackle of static filled the cockpit. Then a voice. Vance, that you? Arthur froze. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. Rel frowned. Who is that? Arthur exhaled sharply. Trouble, he muttered. The comms crackled again. You're a hard man to find, Vance. And rumor has it you're carrying some valuable cargo. Arthur tightened his grip on the controls. He knew that voice. And if he had found them, the slavers weren't far behind. Arthur exhaled slowly, glancing at Rel. We need a new plan, he said. Her expression hardened. Then let's make one. Arthur smirked, despite the tension in his chest. Now you're talking. The ship kept drifting, the unknown vessel closing in. And Arthur had a feeling things were about to get a hell of a lot more complicated. Arthur had been in enough bad situations to recognize when one was about to go from bad to worse. The unknown ship was closing fast, too fast for it to be anything but trouble. And when Cade Varick's voice crackled through the comms, smooth and knowing, Arthur felt the weight of past mistakes settle in his gut. Vance, that you? Arthur didn't react outwardly, but his fingers tightened over the controls. It had been years since he'd heard that voice, and yet it carried the same smugness, the same unshakable confidence. Yeah, Cade, it's me. A chuckle came through the speakers. You're a hard man to find, and rumor has it you're carrying some valuable cargo. Arthur exhaled slowly. His eyes flicked toward Rel, who was watching him closely. Suspicion and tension coiled in her stance. What does he mean? She asked quietly. Arthur didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he flipped the comms back on. You always did have a knack for showing up at the worst possible time. Kate let out a low laugh. Come on now, Vance. This doesn't have to be difficult. You hand over the woman and the kid, and we all walk away happy. Arthur forced a smirk. Yeah, see, I have a real problem with that plan. Cade sighed, as if Arthur was the one being unreasonable. I figured you'd say that, which is why I brought backup. A second red blip appeared on the radar. Arthur cursed under his breath. Rel straightened beside him. More of them. Arthur nodded. Looks like Cade's got friends. Rel's hand twitched toward the pistol at her hip. Then we fight. Arthur exhaled. We survive. He switched the ship's comms to a private channel and patched through to the engine room, where Oren was supposed to be hiding. Kid, you strapped in? A brief pause. Then Oren's voice, small but steady. Yeah. Arthur nodded to himself. Good. Sit tight. He flipped the channel off and turned to Rel. We don't have time for a straight fight. If we let them dock, we're done. We need to lose them. Rel frowned. How? Arthur checked the NAV screen, scanning for options. The Kessrin belt wasn't far, an asteroid field dense enough to make pursuit a nightmare. But getting through at a high speed? Suicide. Arthur had never been the cautious type. He locked in the course and gunned the thrusters. The ship lurched forward, rocketing toward the asteroid belt. Cade's voice crackled back to life. Arthur, what the hell are you doing? Arthur grinned, making things interesting. Cade's ship followed, along with the second vessel. The asteroid field loomed ahead, jagged rocks spinning in chaotic patterns, some as small as a fist, others the size of capital ships. The navigation system screamed warnings as Arthur pushed the ship to its limits. "Hold on," he called. The first asteroid zipped past, close enough that Arthur could feel the ship vibrate from a near miss. The second barely skimmed past the hull. "Vance, you idiot!" Cade's voice was sharper now, edged with real anger. "You're going to get yourself killed." Arthur smirked. "Not myself. Just you." He spun the controls, twisting the ship into a sharp turn, weaving through the belt like a thread through fabric. He didn't have to outrun Cade. Just make sure Cade didn't keep up. The second ship wasn't as lucky. A massive asteroid clipped its wing, sending it spiraling into another rock before erupting in a bright orange explosion. "One down," Arthur muttered. Cade's ship, however, was still on him. Arthur gritted his teeth. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Cade's voice came through again, more control now. "Arthur, listen to me. You can't run forever. The people who want that kid, they don't give up, and you know it." Arthur's smirk faded. Yeah, he knew it. Cade continued, his tone almost genuine now. "You think you're helping them? All you're doing is delaying the inevitable." Arthur glanced at Rel. She was staring at him, waiting to see what he would do. He exhaled sharply and flipped the comms back on. "You know what, Cade? Maybe you're right." Cade hesitated. "What?" Arthur locked onto a massive asteroid spinning in a slow, predictable arc. He hit the throttle, speeding straight toward it. Cade swore. "Vance, don't you dare." Arthur waited until the last possible second. Then he killed the engines. The ship dropped, momentum carrying it under the asteroid's path, barely missing the jagged rock. Cade wasn't as lucky. His ship swerved too late, clipping the edge of the asteroid, sending it tumbling out of control. Arthur gunned the engines again, rocketing toward open space. Behind him, Cade's ship struggled to stabilize. Arthur exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. He turned to Rel. "We're clear." Rel let out a slow breath, sinking into the co-pilot's chair. "That was reckless." Arthur smirked. "Yeah, but it worked." She shook her head, but there was something almost impressed in her expression. The private comm channel buzzed to life. "Arthur." Oren's voice was quiet. Arthur's smirk faded. "Yeah, kid." There was a brief silence. Then, "You didn't have to do that. You could have let him take us." Arthur leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "Yeah, well, I don't let people take what's mine." Oren hesitated. "We're yours." Arthur blinked. He looked at Rel, who was watching him carefully. Something unspoken passed between them. Arthur exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I mean, yeah, I guess you are." Silence. Then, to his surprise, Oren laughed. It was soft, small, but real. Arthur felt something settle in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Oren's voice came back, lighter now. "Can I still learn to fly?" Arthur groaned. "Kid, I swear." Rel smirked. Arthur sighed, shaking his head. Yeah, we'll start tomorrow." Oren cheered through the comms. Arthur exhaled, letting the tension drain from his body. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. Arthur had always believed that space was a place for loners, drifters, and people running from their past. It had suited him just fine until now. Now, as he stood in the cockpit, watching Rel settle into the co-pilot's chair and Oren poking at the console like it was the most fascinating thing in the universe, Arthur felt something he hadn't in a long time. Something dangerously close to home. The ship hummed beneath his boots, steady and familiar, but there was a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with gravity. Because while they had escaped for now, Arthur knew better than to think they were safe. The slavers wouldn't give up, and neither would Cade. A flicker on the navigation screen caught his attention. A distress beacon, weak, intermittent, but still active. "Cade." Arthur exhaled slowly, staring at the blinking signal. Rel must have noticed his expression because she turned to him, her dark eyes sharp. "What is it?" Arthur hesitated, then tapped the display. "Cade's still out there." "He made it." Rel folded her arms. "And," Arthur smirked, "and he's probably real mad." Rel watched him carefully. Are you going to help him? Arthur considered it. There had been a time, years ago, when he wouldn't have hesitated. Cade had saved his ass more than once back in the day. But that was before. Before Cade had put a bounty on a kid. Before he had threatened people Arthur had come to care about. Arthur reached out and, without a word, shut the distress signal off. Rel arched a brow. No second thoughts? Arthur exhaled, leaning back in his seat. He made his choice. I'm making mine. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Arthur expected her to say something sarcastic, maybe tease him for suddenly having a moral compass. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She smiled. Not a smirk, not an amused tilt of her lips. A real smile. Arthur felt his stomach drop. He was in trouble. Arthur. Oren came bounding into the cockpit, grinning so wide his sharp teeth showed. Can I fly now? Arthur groaned. Kid, we just finished getting away from a bounty hunter. Can we maybe not risk crashing the ship immediately after? Oren pouted. But I fixed the stabilizer. Arthur narrowed his eyes. You fixed it. Oren crossed his arms. Yeah, it was just a bad relay. I rerouted the power flow so it wouldn't short out again. Arthur glanced at Rel. She just shrugged, clearly as surprised as he was. Arthur let out a slow breath. Huh. Oren frowned. Huh. That's all you're going to say? Arthur smirked. All right, fine. Good job, kid. Now, get out of my chair. Oren perked up. Does that mean I get my flying lesson? Arthur sighed. You really don't give up, do you? Oren grinned. Nope. Arthur shook his head, defeated. All right, fine. But if you break my ship, I'm leaving you on the next moon we pass. Oren practically vibrated with excitement as he scrambled into the co-pilot's seat. Arthur leaned over, adjusting the settings. All right, rule number 1. Don't touch anything unless I say so. Rule number 2. If I do say so, don't panic. Oren nodded eagerly. What if I do panic? Arthur smirked. Then we crash and die. Oren's face paled. What? Hated sight. Arthur. Arthur chuckled. Relax. We probably won't die. Oren didn't look reassured, but his hands were steady on the controls. Arthur guided him through the basics. How to adjust pitch, how to read the navigation display, how not to accidentally shut off the oxygen supply. The kid caught on fast. A little too fast. All right, I think that's enough for today, Arthur said, reaching to switch back to autopilot. But I want to try a turn. Oren protested. Arthur shook his head. No way. First-time flyers don't get to. Before he could finish, Oren accidentally nudged the thruster controls. The ship lurched, tilting sharply. Arthur's stomach dropped. Damn it, kid. Oren yelped, gripping the seat. Sorry. Arthur quickly regained control, leveling them out. A tense silence followed. Then, Rel laughed. Arthur turned to her, incredulous. Oh, you think this is funny? Rel smirked. A little. Arthur exhaled, rubbing his face. You're both going to kill me. Oren gave him an innocent grin. Does this mean I can't fly again? Arthur groaned. Not for a long time. Oren pouted. Rel shook her head. I did warn you. Arthur sighed, slumping back into his chair. Yeah. Next time, remind me not to make promises to hyperactive children. The ship hummed beneath them, steady, solid. For the first time in years, Arthur wasn't flying alone. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't mind. Later that night, Arthur was in the engine room, doing a routine check, when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to find Rel standing there, arms folded. Couldn't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with something unspoken. Finally, Rel said, You could have left us behind. It would have been easier. Arthur held her gaze. Yeah, but I didn't want to. Something shifted in her expression. Then, before he could think twice, she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint trace of exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders had finally lost some of their tension. Arthur, she said quietly, and then, before he could respond, she kissed him. Soft, warm. The kiss was hesitant at first, like she wasn't sure if she should, like she wasn't sure if she could. But Arthur didn't pull away. Instead, he let himself lean into it. It was slow, unhurried, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them since the moment they met. When they finally pulled apart, Rel searched his face as if waiting for him to crack a joke, to say something sarcastic. He didn't. For once, he just let the moment be. Rel exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You're impossible." Arthur smirked. "Yeah, but you like me anyway." She rolled her eyes, but there was no heat behind it. Arthur reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. For the first time in a long time, he belonged. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur Vance was finally home.